Okay, then the chair can start the meeting.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this panel. I don't know if they can hear us on Zoom. Let's check to make sure. Oh, good. Excellent. So we have our two co-editors on Zoom. They couldn't come in person, so please bear with us. So join us for this session. But it's my pleasure to welcome you. My name is Moses Ochonu. I'm one of the editors, and we'll just go around and introduce ourselves first before we start, if that's okay. So I've introduced myself. How about we?
Hi, everyone. I'm Dan Magaziner. I am the outgoing book review editor for the Journal of African History. Although, as I'll explain in a minute, that position is changing a little bit as book reviews, the status of book reviews changes in the profession.
Hello, my name is Samuel Severson. I am the managing editor of the Journal of African History, which is largely comprised of administrative tasks and the copy editing of accepted articles.
Hi, my name is Kalalangal Mulme. I am on the advisory editorial board, and I review articles.
Okay, I'm Cassandra Martison. I'm also a member of the editorial advisory board.
So next, Marisa and Michelle, you could introduce yourself.
Okay. Hi, I'm Marissa Moorman. I'm one of the editors of the Journal of African History.
And hello, everyone. I'm Michelle Lloyd, also an editor of the journal, and I do East Africa.
Okay, well, so again, thanks for being here. And the way that the journal is set up, we have an editorial advisory board that Cassandra and Kalala are members of, and then we have 4 editors. Okay, we have myself. I deal with North Africa and West Africa. We have Michelle, who is the editor for East Africa, and we have Marisa, who is the editor for Southern and Central Africa. And we have the 4th editor position, whose remit is pretty wide. They deal with all kinds of things that I'll let Dan talk about, because Dan will talk about that shortly. But the 4th editor has an expansive portfolio. So without further ado, I think we'll just go around and talk about what it is that we do as editors of the journal. And then hopefully we'll talk about what it takes to be published in the Journal of African History, right? Because I'm sure you guys are dying to hear that. There's no mystery to it, by the way. So, you know, there's nothing mysterious about it. But to start, as an editor of the journal, when I get a paper, the first thing I do is I read through it. It's not a very close reading. That first reading is not close, okay? More like skimming through it, right? But I'm looking for certain features. When I do that first reading, that first read through, I'm not trying to exclude the paper. I'm not trying to look for reasons to disqualify the paper. I know there's a lot of belief out there that we do a lot of gatekeeping and that we're always looking for reasons to disqualify a paper. No, I am looking for the things that we as editors look for. I'm looking at the footnotes. I'm looking at the sources. How well sourced is this paper? Is this paper significantly based on primary sources? That's one of the most important criteria that I look at, right? That first read, just looking at the paper, I'm looking for that. I'm looking at, does this paper have an argument that as a historian I can relate to, right? So I'm looking for that. I might pay some attention during that first read, even though that's not critically important, but I might pay some attention to the writing, okay, the quality of the writing. If the writing is problematic in a significant way, that might raise some concerns with me as an editor, okay? Because journal publishing is about communication, communicating scholarly ideas and arguments and scholarly findings, right? So if the writing is such that the communication cannot succeed, you can't communicate clearly what it is that you are trying to say, that's going to be a red flag for me. So that's the first read. And then I have to decide, based on all of these factors, whether to send it out for review, right? Has this paper met the bare minimum requirement to be sent out to external reviewers, right? Or has it failed to meet those thresholds? So is it based primarily on secondary sources? If that's the case, academics are very busy people. There's no need for me to waste reviewers' time. They have a lot on their plate. So why bother them with the review, right? But also, why waste the author's time? Because at that point, I have to make an informed judgment as an editor that this journey, if I were to begin this review journey, it will probably not end well, right? It doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure that out. In that case, I think it's better to just say to the author, this is a big problem that you need to walk through and overcome before we can send this paper to review, because we can almost predict that if this paper goes to review, it will not succeed. So let's not waste everybody's time. So that's one part of it. If there is no argument in the paper, we historians, we are big on arguments. If there is no argumentative through line, if there's no argument that is well crafted and framed in the introduction and is carried through the paper, again, I can safely predict that if the paper goes to review, the outcome will not be favorable, will not be positive. So again, it is my job to not begin a journey that will not end well, right? So I have to make a judgment at that point. But if I do decide that this paper deserves to be reviewed, then the next stage is for me to look around. We have a database of reviewers, mostly previous reviewers, people who have reviewed for the journal before that we can return to. Although we try not to return to someone too often, we try to cast our net as wide as possible. But the choice of who to review the paper sometimes comes down to who says yes. That's just the unfortunate truth about it, because our field is relatively small, right? And when, some of the subfields that people are writing articles on, those subfields are quite small as well. Sometimes with as few as 10 people working in that field. Some of those people may be on their way to retirement. You don't want to bother them, in retirement. There are all kinds of things that people have going on. Some of them may be junior scholars who are busy with their tenure process and promotion process, and so you look for the right person who is likely to say yes, who is likely to give a good review of the paper, who is likely to sit down and spend some time on the paper and give a very thorough review of the paper. But somebody who can also say yes, but also somebody who can deliver in the time frame, because I think we have 6 weeks. Our template, Sam, am I correct? Yes. But we can always extend it, but the standard time for review is 6 weeks. And so then I sent the article out to sometimes 2 reviewers, but sometimes 3 reviewers. Sometimes I might send emails to 5 potential reviewers and 3 people say yes, and then we go with them. But the minimum is 2. The minimum number of reviewers is 2. So we send the article out and then we wait. The waiting game begins for me as an editor, but also for you as an author. And there's no predicting how long the wait will last. It's totally up to the reviewers. Some reviewers, life happens. Situations arise in their lives and it delays their submission of the review. People have babies. I've had to deal with people who, had babies in the middle of the review timeline, and some other people, travel and they get busy. Some people just are swamped by all kinds of obligations and responsibilities. So sometimes there is a delay. And we as editors have to grant a lot of extensions. Throughout that process, we try to carry the authors along. I have to confess, because of my own busy schedule, I'm not very faithful in doing that. So sometimes I forget when there is a delay and there's an extension granted, I forget to tell the author. In that case, the author is free to send an email to me to remind me what's happening with my paper. And then usually either myself or Sam, the managing editor, sends a short email saying, this is the status. It's out for review. We granted an extension to the reviewer. Please be patient with us, something along those lines. And we just let the review, the reports come in, and based on at least 2 reports, once we have 2 reports, we can make a decision. And then I, as an editor, will make a decision on what to do next. The choices that we give our reviewers are pretty much three choices: reject, review, revise and resubmit, and accept without revision. Those are the 3 choices. I know some journals who give 4 choices, but let me say one more thing and then I'll stop and yield the floor. A lot of our I would say, if I were to give an estimate, I would say that 95% of the articles that we publish in the journal, the research articles that come out in the Journal of African History, first get an R&R, which is the revise and resubmit. Okay? But there's a lot of misunderstanding around that decision, that revise and resubmit decision. I myself, when I was a younger scholar, I misunderstood it. Okay, when I got my first R&R, which is the revise and resubmit, I think I was down for a couple of days at least. I was so discouraged. I was so unhappy with it. I was like, man, revise and resubmit. I have to revise it and then resubmit and begin the process from scratch. Oh man. So, but there's a lot of, but I give you that number, I would say even up to 98. To be honest, I've been editor for getting to 4 years now. In my time as editor, we've only accepted one. Yes, one paper. We've only had one paper who got an outright acceptance in the first go of the review process, right? I mean, I think that number is correct. Every other paper that has come out in the journal first got an R&R, which is the revise and resubmit. But what our job as editor then is to guide the author in the revision process. Sometimes an R&R is borderline, which is it straddles the border between reject and revise and resubmit, right? But sometimes the R&R is on the border of acceptance. It's on the threshold, it's on the cusp of acceptance. So the nature of the R&R determines the email that I write to the author. But I try to sweeten it either way, whatever kind of R&R it is. I try to kind of make it land easily on the author, so that the author doesn't think that their chances of publishing in the journal is slim. So I try to make it easier to take. I try to be constructive in my comments. I try to be specific in terms of our expectations for revising this paper. And I just try to give as clear as a guide as possible. And if the author doesn't understand anything, I invite questions. We'll have a dialogue going, we'll have a conversation. And in the end, usually we come to the same point in terms of what needs to be done, what the paper needs to do. And so I'll just stop here. We can return to some of these other issues later on. Okay. Yes.
So as my colleague has laid out, the process to get a research article published is a rather long process and an onerous process and a process where success is very uncertain. And it's one that I had a similar experience to Professor Shonu, which is the first time I got an R&R from the Journal of African History. It did take me 2 days to recover. I never recovered, and I never revised and never resubmitted. And so don't be like me, I guess, but you know. And the thing is, and we were just conferring about the statistics, if you submit a research article to the JH and a very large number of those, a significant number will be rejected out of hand for a variety of reasons, such as the ones that my colleague just laid out. But even those that go through the revision process, it's a very high threshold to get published because we only publish on average, what, 15 or so research articles a year?
I think 18.
18 research articles a year, which for the entire volume of the journal, which means that there's going to be more submissions than we can possibly publish. There are other ways to be published in the Journal of African History, though, and I want to talk a little bit about what those are because they have very different thresholds for publication, and they're also different kinds of writing. And for many people, especially for graduate students or people just starting out, one of the best ways that you can begin to develop your publication record is by submitting a different sort of publication to the JH, not just a research article, but shorter pieces. And traditionally, the JH has had just research articles and book reviews. And I'll talk a little bit about what book reviews are and what they look like in the JH, because that is the current hat that I wear, where I wear a hat, which is the book review editor for the Journal of African History. But as I mentioned at the outset, at the end of this, actually right now, happening imminently, we are transitioning away from a book review model for various reasons having to do with how our publisher, Cambridge University Press, is able to monetize the publications that we produce within the journal. So what that means is we're going to be publishing fewer book reviews and more other sorts of submissions. And there are two that I want to highlight to you. One, which is called feature reviews or historiographical essays, and the other, which is a new feature within the JH, or at least relatively new in the last year, which is called History Matters. And I want to describe each of those in turn, and perhaps some of you have submissions that you would consider. Let me begin with book reviews, though, because that's probably the most familiar form for people. Talk about a little bit about what book reviews are within the JH, what they look like, and the process. So there's two ways that a book review can end up being published in the JH. One is kind of the inverse of the submission process that Professor Shonu was describing, which is we commission reviews, which is a book comes in, it seems like it's topical or important, it's by a scholar whose work we think we want to highlight, and we'll reach out to across our networks, drawing on the support of the advisory board, drawing the support of other colleagues in the field to try and identify a reviewer who would offer something valuable in response to the book. That is a very common form, but we also receive book review submissions from people who've read really interesting books and would like to share their response to the book to us. In both cases, what we look for as a piece of writing is very similar. Book reviews are to be relatively short. The initial submission we request to be at 800 words, which is not a very long, it's like a fairly long Facebook post, but it is certainly not a 10,000 word article. With subsequent revision, now that we're no longer publishing in print, book reviews can kind of get a little bit bigger. We will have them go as long as 2,000 words during the subsequent revision process. But what a book review should do is offer an appreciation of the book. What is it that the author set out to achieve? What is the argument that they develop? And an assessment about whether or not they actually succeed along the terms that they've laid out. One of the ways that you'll be able to assess whether or not they succeed in their argumentation is, are they in conversation with other scholarship? So here, what we look for in a book review, both in those we commission and those we receive, is that you demonstrate why it is that we should take your response to the book to heart. why it is that you are someone who knows a lot about a field such that you're capable of assessing the quality of this book. And so we look for book reviews that place the book into conversation with other scholarship. Is it contributing to a field? Is it revising a field? Is it breaking totally new ground? We look for examples of how the author uses their sources, how the author writes, some assessment as you see it of the sort of value of the book, both as a research object and to some extent as an aesthetic object. Because writing, as Professor Shonu said, writing is communication. And if the book doesn't communicate effectively, it's not a particularly effective book. What we don't often want is bulleted in chapter 1, summary of the book. In chapter 2, summary of the chapter. In chapter 2, summary of the chapter. In chapter 3, summary of the chapter. What we look for is something that goes a little bit more critical than that, that can easily give our readers a sense of what is this book as a whole? What does it offer? Why does it appear in the world? How does it function effectively or not? Necessarily, there will be some summary, but it can't just be summary. And it has to instead offer more of a critical reading. And I want to end on talking about book reviews with that critical part of it. We look for book reviews that are what I often think of as productively critical or generatively critical. We're not going to publish a takedown because a book is a significant achievement, whether it's a crap book or not. It takes a lot of work to produce a book, and we don't serve, our journal is not a space to diminish that. But it is a space to engage critically in things that the book does or does not do well. And this is often very hard. Scholars are really hesitant to criticize others' work as if we are kind of preemptively kind of cringing in expectation of people criticizing our work down the road. But a good book review has to engage critically. It has to open up that space for conversation, not in a mean way, but in an effective way, in a useful way. And occasionally there's a book that's just amazing and you can't think of anything critical to say, in which case it's okay to say this book is amazing, but you have to be able to explain that to us to substantiate that judgment. So book reviews, the JH in a calendar year will publish, it used to be around 45 to 60 book reviews in the past. Now we're down to about 30 because for reasons, again, that have to do with the publishing model of our publisher, Cambridge University Press. But we do have two other forms of publications that we encourage submissions. One is featured reviews, which can take multiple forms. Usually if there's a book that is of significant value that, and this is a somewhat subjective standard, but if there is some book that is seen to be field shaping in some way, we will commission an extended review of the book that places the book historiographically within scholarship and gives us a much fuller sense of why this book is so significant. Those are usually commissioned. But ones that we are actually happy to get submissions is if you're working in a particular field and you think, having surveyed 3 or 4 books within the field, that there's something notable and novel happening, we invite submissions of what we call still featured reviews, but really functionally they're historiographical essays. They're an essay where you have taken it upon yourself to assess the field, assess these new books that have come out in the field as a whole, and to offer some sort of synthesis of what it is that you see as novel in this scholarship, what new directions are being opened for us, and to provide your own argument about what this means. What does it suggest about the study of this particular subject? What does it suggest about the development of the fields? So those feature reviews are usually longer. We've had some that go to 5, 6, 7,000 words, and they're an opportunity for a much more expansive survey of a field, and we invite those sorts of submissions. They will go through a peer review process similar to what Professor Shonu describes. It's a little bit different than a conventional book review. And finally, the third form of submission that we invite you to consider is this new form called History Matters that we've developed in the last couple of years. And what that offers is an opportunity for historians to intervene in contemporary politics and contemporary events, in something significant that is happening at the moment that historians have a valuable perspective on. And there's numerous examples of this that I could give. For example, I work in South Africa, and as you probably know, this past April, represented 30 years since the first democratic elections in South Africa. So for History Matters, for the first issue of 1994, we invited historians based both in South Africa and in North America to reflect on 30 years of not South African democracy, but 30 years of post-apartheid history. And so we had a conversation among historians about how the study of history has changed since 1994. We just concluded a board meeting of the JH earlier today, and we were discussing a future History Matters that's in the pipeline, which is about the question of restitution, and especially focused on things like the Benin bronzes and how or why or if those should be returned to Nigeria, and what restitution means, and how historians who are specialists in perhaps the history of the Benin expedition in the late 19th century, or specialists in the history of museums, or specialists in the history of royalty and kingship in pre-colonial Africa, all those things that historians can offer that responds to a hot button political issue, which is what should be done to repair these historical crimes, but respond from a place of knowledge and a place of scholarship, but do so in a way that is more conversational, that's more accessible, that doesn't have to be a research article as a genre piece, but instead can be a more play with the different genres of historical writing. And so that's somewhere we're really eager to get submissions, perhaps from the audience or people you know who might be working on something from a historical perspective, but with obvious contemporary relevance and resonance, because those History Matters pieces are increasingly becoming part of the JH's mission, and we're really eager to publish more of them. So with both my presentation and Professor Shona's, we'll be very glad to answer any questions you have about that once we finish this initial round of things. Thank you. Yeah. Marissa or Michelle, do you want to speak? Here, let's put this one.
I can say a couple brief things. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Again, I'm Michelle Moyd, and I'm the East Africa editor. And I really just wanted to expand on a couple points that Professor Ochonu mentioned about what we look for as editors. So he mentioned argument being a really important part of kind of the initial assessment of when an article comes in. And I wanted to just say a bit more about that, because one of the more common problems that I tend to see with submissions that I look at is there may be an argument, but it has not yet gotten outside of itself. And what I mean by that is it's not engaging historiography. So it may be very tightly engaged with a set of primary sources that the author has worked with extensively and very closely, and they have done a good job of turning that into an article that has a kind of an argument, but it has not yet gone outside of itself to engage what has already been produced. And I think that this is an important thing to point out, because often I think, especially for younger scholars who are submitting to the journal or a journal for the first time, perhaps, they've spent so much time really kind of being in close contact with a set of historical sources that are probably part of a dissertation or turning a book into a manuscript, something like that. And they may not have spent as much time thinking about the big so what question. How is this going to change the way we think about a particular topic, a particular subfield in African history? So I wanted to just emphasize that it's not just, I mean, argument is important, but it's not just argument. It's an argument that is also striving to that is built on primary sources, and that is also trying to engage historiography that already exists. And this is I think all the more important because sometimes we hear back from reviewers, some of whom are quite senior in the field, who are like, why are they, this is all stuff that was done in X decade, or there's this whole body of scholarship that they haven't looked at. And so it's worth it to take a step back and do your due diligence and go back and figure out what historians have already done before, especially before we end up sending it to sometimes irritated senior scholars who are frustrated that you're trying to reinvent the wheel. So that was one thing. The other thing is I just wanted to emphasize too that so this is the Journal of African History, and one of the things that we sometimes see are submissions that come in that are perhaps dealing more with imperial or colonial history in ways that are not necessarily grounded in African history sensibilities. So it's really important here as well to kind of make sure that that journal submissions are to the JAH are really engaged with questions that are important to historians of Africa. That doesn't mean that you can't write about empire and colonialism, but that it's important to always return to the central questions that matter for historians of Africa. And I'm happy to talk more about what that looks like in the Q&A. But I think those are the two key points that I just wanted to kind of elaborate from Professor Achonu's great remarks earlier on.
Yeah, Marisa, thank you, Michelle.
Yeah, well, there's not a whole lot left. I mean, you all have covered this so well. I mean, I'll just underscore, I think, what Professor Moyd just added to say that I think some of what comes over the transom is rejected because it's imperial history or kind of colonial history that doesn't really reflect what we do. So part of that is just no matter where you're submitting, whether it's for a historical journal or another type of journal, do your research, study up, read the journal's webpage. It's not hard to find information about journals nowadays. Read 5 to 7 articles that have been published in the past 8 to 10 years by that journal to get a sense of the different kinds of work and that people are doing and that is being published. And there's increasingly more kind of interdisciplinary scholarship. And there's also, and of course, I think African historians forever have been interdisciplinary in their work. But if you are a person who's not trained as a historian, think hard about how your article manuscript is making an historical argument, not just because it's about the past, but what is the sort of historiographical intervention that it's making. Sometimes we get pieces that just assume because something's about something that happened in the past, it is historical. So I think you want to be clear about those things. And I also just want to emphasize that we don't expect papers when they're submitted to be perfect. A revise and a resubmit is an absolutely honorable and excellent thing to have in your inbox, right? You want to be in conversation with other scholars about how to make your work better. And that's what our job is as editors. And along those same lines, you want to make sure that you're meeting the journal's requirements. I wouldn't submit something that was too long. All of this work we do as volunteer labor. So I think it's important to respect both the labor of the editors and of future readers. Hopefully you'll be a reader someday if you are not already. And so do the work of, either in writing groups or with the support of your colleagues, figuring out how to get a piece to 10,000 words if it's much over that. Pay attention to formatting, citation styles and things like that. All of those things make the paper easier to read and more approachable. And I think it's important to keep those things in mind. Professor Magaziner gave you a little summary of kind of political economic changes that are happening at presses. Cambridge University Press is a huge press. They don't only publish the Journal of African History, they publish very, very many journals. And the changes that are happening that we're facing as editors and the changes in the political economy of how journals work are something not just happening at Cambridge, they're happening pretty much at all of the presses that we know. So I think it's also important to know how it is that journals work, and I think that's really useful information.
Could I add one other thing in which relates to what Professor Mormon just said, which is that it's worth it actually to take a couple hours maybe to, if you haven't before submitting something, to take a look at the Journal of African History and what content it has had in the last 5 to 10 years. Not because we want you to fit into some particular subject matter area or something, but that you can actually see what the article looks like, how authors have framed it, how they have built it, and what with editorial input, right? The finished product shows you what an article tends to look like in the JAH. So it's worth it to spend a bit of time trying to reverse engineer what you see as a published piece, because we often do get pieces submitted that just don't fit. I mean, they're not intended, they're not going to really make it in the journal, as Professor Ochona mentioned early on, because they don't adhere to what we do. So, and there are other journals, plenty of other journals out there that probably will. So it's worth it to just take a minute to explore how the JAH has, what it has looked like in the last decade or so. So yeah.
Thank you. So I really appreciate what my colleagues have told you about kind of the higher level, what makes a good article and some of the different submissions. And I think really what I can add to this discussion is a little bit more of just kind of the nuts and bolts type submission, like how does it work, and so on and so forth. So submissions to the Journal of African History, they all have to be made online using the Scholar One platform. And to find more about that, there is a link on our website, and please come up and feel free to take a card. It has both an email address and also our website on it. And that will link you to the Scholar One system where you can make a profile and complete any submissions of articles that you have. And part of the value of the Scholar One system is that it allows us to anonymize our papers both. So when you submit a paper, it will go out and you will never find out who your reviewers were, and your reviewers will not know who you are. So using this system with me kind of as a referee and the other editors allows us to maintain that anonymity. So that is part of the reason that we use that system, and we don't send things by email and so on and so forth. And within that system, just to walk you through the process, once you click submit and say, yes, I would indeed like to submit the paper, the first step in its journey is it will come into our inbox, or into the inbox, where I will give it an initial read. And I can just tell you, there are a few things which will immediately get me to unsubmit it and send it right back to you, which is not a big deal. They're small things usually, but please, make sure that, as just to echo what my colleagues have said, that you don't go over the word count, for instance. Keep it to 10,000 words. Please make sure that you read the submission guidelines, which will tell you things like use footnotes, not endnotes. Because again, to echo Professor Mormon's point, we rely on the volunteer labor of reviewers. So anything that we can do to make their lives easier as they're reading a paper is good. So if I'm getting something which has endnotes, then it will just be sent back to you and something that you have to handle. Please make sure that this is a historical paper. and that it's using historical methods and that your focus is on Africa. I mean, it's not an issue, but these are the types of things that typically get paper sent back. And then there's the most common thing, which is that there's any sort of identifying information in the paper. So you can't include your name, your email address, where it is that you're studying or working, your affiliation, anything like that, because that will immediately get me to unsubmit it and send it back to you. So just to streamline things, just make sure you don't do that. We're using the ScholarOne system. We're able to, keep your paper very secure. You will get credit for it. All of that stuff is showing up to the editors and to me. It just is keeping it hidden from the reviewers. So that's the logic behind that. A couple other things, just to kind of pick up on what Professor Moorman mentioned about the political economy and the changing landscape, which is this flip that the journal is making at the end of this year to all open access, which is actually for contributors to the journal a really wonderful thing, because anybody anywhere who has a web connection can now go and read articles. So this is a great way to, if you're thinking about a potential journal, this is actually one of the nice things about the Journal of African History as soon as that we will have everything be open access for free to contributors. So it's a good way to expand the reach of your scholarship if that's something that you're interested in. And then, yeah, just to highlight a few other points. On the website, there are some frequently asked questions. There's a tab which can walk you through a lot of the different systems. And please just go and take a look at it, how to submit your article and read through that, how to format your article. Some of those things will just kind of expedite the whole process for everybody if you do that beforehand. And the last thing that I would add is that if you have any questions about the Journal of African History or submitting to it, please feel free just to send us an email. And we have these cards to put a face on the email address. I know sometimes when you send an email to a journal, you don't know it's going into a black box. Well, it will be me that gets that email and I will respond to you. Unfortunately, this is kind of awkward, but our email is not working right now. Cambridge University Press had a little problem, but within a few weeks, we should be back up and running. And please do just send an email if you have any sort of questions. It's my pleasure to correspond with potential contributors to the journal.
Okay, so at this point, we're going to let one of the editorial advisory board members speak about their role in the journal, what it is that they do to contribute to the journal, and how their role relates to submissions. Okay, so I'm going to use my chair's discretion to turn it over to. You said to go to Kalala? Okay. All right. I'll let Kalala. She said to come to you, Kalala. Oh.
Reviewer extraordinaire.
Thank you. Thank you for all the comments. When I receive an article on my desk, of course, I look at all the pieces that my colleagues have talked about. I look at the historiography. Are you engaged in the conversation? When you enter, when you write something, you are entering in a field where scholars have been engaged in conversation before. So how does your work fit in that conversation? Which means what do you have a contribution to make? Are you asking new questions? Are you bringing new evidence, new sources? Are you bringing a new interpretation? So these are things that I look for. Otherwise, why should we spend time reading your piece if you don't have anything to contribute? You see, so we ask those questions. I look for those questions, and then I look at the evidence. Often scholars think that the evidence speaks for itself. It doesn't. You need to analyze it. You need to interpret it. That's how you squeeze the argument out of the evidence. Let's say I can take an example of madness. You are working on madness in Lagos. You have connected all these pieces of legislation. And then you present the ordinances one after another as years go by. That is just description. We haven't analyzed the evidence. What does it mean? And a piece of legislation is actually a result of compromise. You need to go beyond just that piece of legislation to see how it was actually generated, which means looking at minutes of the meetings, who was around the table, various interest groups, and then how did they come up with this? So this piece of it. So you are analyzing that, interpreting it. And then there is also, you cannot say because these are the penalties in 1920 and the penalties, so which means they were tough. You will need to keep in mind that there is a gap between a piece of legislation and its implementation. You will need to look at other sources to see actually, was anybody convicted for throwing trash on the street, you know? Yeah, so these are, which means we have to think about sources in different ways. And keep in mind that gap, the gap between discourse and practices. And then the concept itself, you know, the conceptual framework. Madness is not, does it mean the same thing in 1870, 1890, 1920? Or we have continuity and discontinuities there, you see, in the concept. So you don't take them for granted. And so these are the questions that we look at, you know, how you analyze your sources, how you interpret it. At the end of the day, you ask yourself, is this the best interpretation of this evidence? Because you keep in mind that 20 years from now, will your interpretation stand the test of time? See, and so these are the things that we pay attention to, a critical analysis of the evidence. It doesn't speak for itself. So this is the job we have to do, thinking in mind, okay, have I done a good job here? You see, being critical of yourself, so that when your article is sent back, you get comments. If you have been critical of yourself, you'll take those comments easy, you know, because you are the severest critic of yourself. That way, the comments will come to you, you will welcome them. So it is the critical, being critical. Also, the last thing, silences. What do you do with the silences in the evidence? What do you make of the silences? See, so that, but you need to show your reader that you are aware of those silences. You see. So I can, that's what I'm saying.
All right, so you've just heard from a reviewer, someone who, I'm sorry to out you, but he's a prolific reviewer for the journal. But I mean, we have an abundance of historical talent on the editorial advisory board. So sometimes we lean on them. Why go outside when you have experts on the editorial advisory board? So that's how members of the editorial advisory board support the journal. Because I mean, the thing that my colleague, Professor Makasina, was talking about, the history matters, most of those pieces are actually reviewed by board members, like Cassandra and Professor Hussein and they are reviewed in-house, okay? And even some articles, sometimes the best expert on some of these subject matters are in-house. So we go to them. We're always reaching out to them. Sometimes we go to them, and if they are too busy before we go out. So, but you've just heard what a reviewer looks for, what it looks out for, his expectations, and so on and so forth. There are two questions in the chat that I'm going to address quickly. One of them has to do with historiographical engagement. We've spoken a lot, my colleagues, my fellow editors have spoken a lot about this already. But the thing to, and this was re-emphasized just a few minutes ago, the thing to ask yourself is, how does my analysis extend, critique, or reinforce or deepen the existing perspective? Okay? If you can ask yourself that question and answer it substantively and sincerely to yourself, you're on the right track. Okay? How does my approach, how does my argument extend, revise or critique, or deepen the existing perspective, the existing argument or interpretation? Okay? If you are having trouble answering that question or even asking that question, I'm afraid you have to go back to the drawing board, as they say. The other question has to do with, does a paper have to be set primarily, forgive the redundancy, in primary sources? The answer is yes. For the Journal of African History, we are a traditional historical journal. And so all our submissions, we insist that submissions to us be substantially, not entirely, but substantially, right? We don't put a percentage to it, but we all know what substantially means. But it must be substantially based in primary sources. And that actually brings me to something that I was going to talk about quickly. You know, we gave you earlier, me and my colleagues here, we gave you what we talked to you about what we're looking for, our expectations, right? What you should do to improve your chances of getting into the journal, of your article being sent out for review, right? What about the don'ts, the things that you shouldn't do, right? So we should give you the other side of it as well. Okay, and from my own experience as an editor, I can say that one common thing that I see is articles that are presentist, that deal with presentist issues. We're a history journal that deals with the past. I get a lot of submissions that deal with the present, contemporary, ongoing issues. It confuses me. I don't know what to do with those submissions, because I feel like we're not the right journal. I feel like those pieces should be sent to the Journal of Modern African History, another Cambridge journal, or the numerous other Africanist journals out there that deal with presentist matters. Another common issue that I see that you shouldn't bring to us is articles that are policy oriented. So that articles that do policy prescriptions, or that are set in this context where they're expressly articulated in a way that agitate for or advocate for certain policy changes, right? We don't entertain those. We are historians. We interpret the past. We shed light on the past. We're not in the business of policy prescriptions or making policy recommendations and so on and so forth. Then the last thing that I'll talk about, I've already talked about wrong journal. There are a lot of submissions that I get, and I'm sure Professor Moorman and Professor Moyd get those submissions as well. That forces us to scratch our head. Why did this person send this to us? This is actually a funny story. Sam, recently we got 2 submissions from a scholar in India, but it was some veterinary science or something. It's like some mosquitoes or something. It's like, this thing, what is this? Is this a mistake? Is this an error? No, believe it, it happened. We got it. And I was like, this should go to a science journal. But that's the extreme. But we get a lot of submissions. You won't believe this. That should go to political science journals, sociology journals, economics journals. They are just not historical articles. So wrong journal. That's a lot of articles get desk rejected. I just take a look at it, and this is not for us. This is not for the Journal of African History. So lastly, a dissertation chapter is not a journal paper. It's not a journal article. I get a lot of those as well. So don't send us, another don't is don't send us your dissertation chapter unless you've substantially revised it. Because a dissertation chapter works within the larger body of scholarly work. As a standalone, if you leave it unrevised, if you don't turn it, if you don't do the work to turn it into a journal article, it cannot stand alone. Because I've read dissertation chapters that were sent to me to review, and I was reading through and said, oh, as I said in chapter 4, as discussed in chapter 3, you are making references to chapters that I haven't seen, parts of the work that I haven't. So a dissertation chapter. That's not to say you shouldn't send us a dissertation chapter, but you should revise it substantially so that it stands alone, so that it has an argument that runs through it, so that the reader reads it and it makes sense on its own without referencing other part of the work. In fact, a lot of the manuscript that we get, submissions that we get from younger scholars, started their lives as dissertation chapters, and then transition and were transformed into journal articles. And some of them get published. So I'm not discouraging you but I'm just saying it requires a lot of work to transform a dissertation chapter. PhD, master's, it doesn't matter, to transform it into a viable journal manuscript. Okay? So with that said, we have about 30 minutes for Q&A questions. So we're going to turn it over to questions. We can pass this around. So, yeah. So we'll start with you.
Okay. Thank you. Good evening, everyone. My name is Dominic. So my question is with regard to indexing body. Is the journal indexed? Because in some universities in Nigeria, they will require like you publishing in journals indexed in Scopus or in Web of Science before you will be now considered for promotion to a professor or assistant professor. I want to know if the journal is indexed in either Scopus or Web of Science. Then with regard to English, good English or grammar, you know, most of us scored 50 to pass English in Nigeria here. And that is not a good score to qualify for writing an article in good English. And some of us are also afraid to send this article to an English student or lecturer because of fear of the idea being stolen. So is there no way, maybe through all this software that corrects English, that the journal will now help the author to correcting the English instead of now this author taking the paper to another person? Then the issue of reviewer. I know that there are reviewers that maybe as a state of their mind at that particular time they are reviewing the work, you will see biasness in their report. How do you decipher those? Then APC charge, do you collect APC charge or is the publication free of charge? Then do you accept book chapters? When you want to go for appraisal, there are universities that score more points to book chapters and books than to journal articles. So people wanting now to boost their score will want to go to either book chapters, monograms, or books. So do you accept the book chapters? Thank you.
Right. Thank you very much for the privilege once again. So my question is that, does the organization accept journals for undergraduates? I'm an undergraduate doing my bachelor's degree, and I've written few academic papers and not been published. So is it only for masters, PhD students? Is there a program for bachelor degrees as students? Thank you very much.
It's okay. Okay. Can you walk us, thank you all so much also to those out there. And can you walk us through the revise and resubmit process? Like what's the timeline for the author, generally speaking? Are extensions granted? What does that look like, depending on the major or the minor revisions? Thank you.
First and foremost, let me appreciate the gathering for educating us or enlightening us on how to write a journal article. When you were talking earlier, you made mention of making use of footnotes. So I want to ask, is there a particular referencing style for the footnote, as in like Chicago style referencing? And sorry, in the area of argumentation, do we need to like introduce a kind of literature review to identify some gaps or flaws in order to bring out our arguments, to make our arguments?
Yeah, so please, I want to add one thing, sir. Is OICID ID or CID, is it compulsory? Yeah. Is it compulsory for an undergraduate?
Oh. Why don't
you want to take a move?
No, you didn't know. So we have a bunch of questions here, about 6, 7 of them. Should we let's go to some Professor Moma and Professor Moy, I don't know if you got those questions. Do you want to respond quickly to any of them? Please feel free.
I can just say something about the literature review one quickly. Literature review in the conventional sense, I would say, is not a requirement. However, as I mentioned before, and as has come up a couple of times now, it's important to somewhere in the article have an explicit engagement with existing historiography and perhaps other literatures that inform your analysis and help you to provide the context, intellectual context, and kind of framework for understanding the argument that you're going to make based on the primary sources that you've analyzed. So it's not, you know, there's not a section of the article that says literature review and then you go through for a while and explain. But it's more sort of, it should be more of an organic interweaving into the first part of the paper, and then you know, references as necessary throughout the rest of the article draft to help kind of anchor your argumentation.
So I can say a couple of things about revise and resubmit, and also because there's a question here on the chat about the R&R process. And I think Sam can add more of the kind of nuts and bolts details about this. But I guess I would just start out by saying that it's not a strict, you know, plenty of people sit on it for a while. People, you know, you get busy, you're teaching, you're doing other things. And so not everybody, because we're all dependent on other people in this process, when you receive a revise and resubmit, it might not be the best moment for you. Maybe it's exam time and you don't have time to look at it for a while. So we can be flexible, and often are, almost always are flexible with those deadlines. It probably will give you a date by which it asks you to resubmit, but we're always happy to reschedule that. If we've entered this kind of journey with you, I think Professor Ochono described it as a journey, we don't want to kick you out of the process. We're committed to making the best, making the work the best that it can be. So that's, I think, so dates and deadlines in that sense are always open to revision. The question in the chat was about what are some good, like, do's and don'ts about dealing with reviewer suggestions. I think there can be times where you get reviews of your work and they can seem incorrect, or they can be using experience, information, evidence from another research site to make assumptions about what your research should look like. And I think if there are what you feel are errors in someone's assessment, you should feel free to say so. The editor's job when we receive reviews is to synthesize them, and also to add our own evaluation to them, right? And to try to present to you as an author a useful, a kind of strategy or game plan for how to revise. That's mostly what we all see each other's emails, and that's what I see all of us doing, right? Sometimes in different ways. Sometimes you'll get reviews that are really different, one that's very positive, one that's very negative. And it's our job as editors to try to help you manage that process. I would say, and then, you know, a don't is to assume that the editors and the reviewers are out to get you. That's generally not the case. Nobody's doing this. Like I said, nobody's being paid lots of money to do this. Nobody's being paid at all. So that we're really trying to engage people's work very sincerely. And I would say by and large, that is also the case for reviewers. I have not seen nasty, I've been doing this for 5 years, almost 5 years, and I haven't seen any really nasty reviews. I've seen mostly really constructive reviews. So I think those are the main things. I think you can be in conversation with the editor if you have doubts about how to approach the revision. There's no reason not to email the editor and be in conversation with them. I think the point is, you know, to figure out a way that is workable to do the revision.
Thank you so much, Professor Mormon. And just to echo what's already been said on that front, to tell you about kind of the timeline, typically speaking, the revise and resubmits go a lot faster because often the reviews will be sent back to the same reviewers and see they can assess whether or not their concerns have been adequately addressed or considered at least. Sometimes they're busy or there's some sort of, like if the person thinks that one of the the submitter thinks that one of the reviews was not great or that productive, then we can go and find somebody else if necessary. But often the revise and resubmits, just because there are people lined up who are already invested in that paper, they do go much quicker. In terms of kind of the timeline, there are a few things that I would add. First off, it does give you 1 month to revise and resubmit in the ScholarOne system, but that is totally flexible. Just email me when you're ready to resubmit and I can go and open up the dates again. Again, my email address is here, jh@cambridge.org. But I'm more than happy to do that. The one thing I would keep in mind is if there is any possibility that you are going to resubmit, please try to at least contact me within a year of the decision so that I can make sure that the paper stays in our system, because ScholarOne, this thing, will archive papers after a year, which makes them very difficult. There is sometimes a fee that an author would have to pay to get them unarchived. So as long as I refresh things in the system before that 1 year has passed, if there's some chance that you think you might actually do the revise and resubmit, please do send it in to me, or just let me know that fact. And the other thing I would just say in terms of the question of is somebody is there a, some of this advice, I consider it, but I don't think it's relevant or it's appropriate. One of the things which you're required to do during revise and resubmit is have a cover letter. And that is your opportunity to explain what your logic is and talking about which revisions you have made. What I would not do is to just completely ignore something that somebody says and ask you to do. It's much better if you say, like, I have considered this and then I'm going and doing this instead because. Just so that way, the editors can all see that you consider the review in good faith and are being conscientious about, working to make the paper as good as possible.
I'm just going to quickly go through a couple of the other questions that were asked. The first regarding language software and language correcting software. So no, basically we don't want any software that has contributed to the submission, which I know makes things challenging for some people, but I mean, I think we're trying to keep it as organic a process as possible. And so we ask that no one use software. There's no fee involved in publishing in JH. We don't republish material. So if it's published as a book chapter, it's not going to be published in JH. And finally, I think there was the question of, but we use Chicago style, recently transitioned to Chicago style. So everything should be submitted in Chicago.
Zotero is great.
Yeah.
To have it built, yeah.
And then finally, we don't accept publications from undergrads. Doesn't come up very often. Admire the ambition, but it's something we really look for work that is at an advanced stage of a graduate program or someone who's just beginning out as a lecturer or someone working in the profession. We have time for some more questions. I think that's
one other, I think, just in terms of the Web of Science, yes.
Oh, yeah.
It's there. Yeah, and I mean, it's in the top quartile of history journals. So it has the Journal of African History has an impact factor of 1.1 or 1. So it's, yeah.
It's the oldest journal. Okay.
Yeah, thank you very much, sir. My name is Sean Kwade. I just want to ask that now, when you're talking about publishing, it's a serious issue, both for the author and for the editors. But I want to know, because this is one of the reasons why people have an impression that editors are gatekeepers. When you send a paper to a journal, obviously, once they start processing that paper, you cannot send that paper to another journal again. You have to put through that process. But if the paper is not coming forth on time, maybe you even if you have seen all the substance, the arguments, the proposition, primary sources, everything in the paper, and you send it to the reviewer. If the reviewer is not forthcoming, and you know that this person is a matter of life, he wants to use that paper for promotion. And paper is taking, you mentioned six weeks. If the 6 weeks, it will be better. I've published a paper, well, more than a paper, that's taking 2 years. Because that's to the review. Is it because the reviewer is not responding on time, or because the process has to take 2 years? Then is there a template, a structure to check on the reviewer to make sure the reviewer responds on time? Because somebody may be reviewing your work, and as you said, sir, you said somebody give birth to a child, pack everything aside, or somebody even change job. And because the editor did not confirm, that person has changed job, and the paper is there, and somebody is expecting. And when you get to the website, you want to check the status and the journal status, and it's under review for months. For 18 months under review. So you'll be discouraged. What's happened? So I want to know whether there is a structure or grant that you can really check on the reviewer. And if the reviewer is not going to be able to review it anymore, whether it can be given to someone else. Because what's important is that you will not be able to send that paper to another journal. I'll be expecting that paper should have been published. Then
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to ask if this journal is institutional based. That's just my question.
Thank you. Yeah, my question is, if it gets to R&R, does the reviewer in any way, being seen as a mentor to the authors, give them guidelines on corrections? Does the reviewer give guidelines on the corrections to be made to make the paper acceptable?
Let me take a stab at some of these questions, and then my colleagues can chime in. But before I do that, I want to go back to the issue of biased review. Your choice of word is interesting to me, biased review. I've never heard that before. But the truth is that reviewers are supposed to be biased, but not in the way that you interpret. Biased in favor of the kinds of things that Professor Ngabalule was talking about. Biased in favor of evidence, primary sources, analysis, all those things. But personal biases, I think this is an honest society. We generally trust historians and reviewers to be professional about the process, to not execute their personal agenda on the paper. Believe me, I've been editor for 4 years, and I've been on both sides of this issue. I've published in journals. I've come to a better understanding of it. I know there's a belief out there, but that's not the case. Reviewers are generally very professional, very ethical. They just want to maintain certain standards. In terms of delays, right? You bring up a very good point. The truth is that as editors, we have our own lives. We don't work on the journal. It's unpaid labor. It's volunteer labor. So we don't work on the journal 24/7, right? We have our jobs, we have our families, we have all these things going on in our lives. So we might not be very regular in reminding reviewers. We might not be reminding them, because sometimes I have 10, 15 articles in my queue, in my box that I'm working with. I'm trying to stay on top of this, all of these articles. So you can imagine, I'll go crazy if I were to send reminders to all these different reviewers. So it is your job. You guys can help us. As an author, you can help us to be more effective in our job by reminding us. There's absolutely nothing wrong with just sending a reminder. What's going on with my article? What's the status? When can I expect a review? And usually we would respond right away and say, this is where we are, and I'm going to send a reminder. That's a cue for me. When I read that email, it's a cue for me to send a reminder. For me and for other editors of the Journal of African History, once you get to a certain point, and also feel free to let us know your personal situation as well. If you are coming up for promotion review, mention that. Yeah. Mention that to us, because that can, help us to craft a different kind of email. If you need it for those purposes, let us know. And then we can even mention it in our email to the reviewer. So that gives it a sense of urgency, right? So if you work with us in that process, usually that works. Usually the reviewer can now speed things up. Sometimes it doesn't work. When it doesn't work, but also since you've mentioned to us that you need this publication for this purpose, we are able to withdraw it from that reviewer and look for a new reviewer. We do that often. We do that all the time. Sam can testify to that.
Yeah.
We recently did something like that.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So is JAH an institutional journal? No, it is not. It is published by CUP, Cambridge University Press, but it is not owned or domiciled in Cambridge University or in any other institution in the world. Chime in, and then
expand on your question, which is, so unfortunately, because we rely on Cambridge University Press, which is the sponsor of the ScholarOne system, I do know, and all the editors are very mindful of the fact that it can be really like opaque. You can't see what's happening inside of it. When you log on, it'll just say your paper is under review. But if you email me, I can definitely I can see a lot more as a referee. I can see how many people it's gone out to, how many people have said yes, who said no, when it's due by. I can see all those types of information. And please, by all means, we understand that these things are very important for people's careers. So if you have queries, just send them to me and I will do my best to get back to you right away. And as Moses said, to prompt as necessary and because it is volunteer labor, there's only so much that we can do as far as like a stick to get people to speed this process along, but we can use guilt, which works pretty well most of the time.
I'd also just say, reviewers will also sometimes say, this looks really interesting to me, but I can't do it right now. Can I have another 2 weeks, or can I get it to you by mid-July? So I think lots of people are aware of the process, and I think by and large, we try very hard to do things in a timely fashion. I certainly nudge reviewers all the time, but there's also, it's increasingly hard to get people to review work. And that's important to know that in the past, I would say 5 to 8 years, it's just gotten harder and harder and harder, and you'll hear that from anybody that's worked at any journal. But communicating about the process, if something's taken a really long time, it's absolutely fine to ask. For the most part, people aren't out, as I said before, people aren't out to get you, but you also need to be clear about what constraints you're working under.
All right, so there's a last question that I want to touch on by Professor Azikiwe, which is the question of the role of the editor when in an R&R situation in guiding the author. Absolutely, that is the most critical part of what we do. There's a lot of hand-holding involved when it gets to that stage, because once a paper receives an R&R, what it says to the editor is that this paper has something to say, has something unique. There's a lot here. The paper is just not ready. So then the challenge is, it is my job to get it ready, because the paper has merit. That's why it got the R&R. That's why it was not rejected. So my job then at that point is to help the author get it ready. And I try to be as specific, and all the editors try to be as specific as possible with the points. Sometimes I might even have a bullet points. That's how specific it gets sometimes in the letters that we write. These are the things that they should, so we do a lot of that. And once the revision comes in, before sometimes sending it out for review again, I look for those things. How much of that have you done? How much of the requested revision have you done? Another thing that I'd like to say quickly is that when you send in the revised version after the R&R. We ask you sometimes, not sometimes, always, to detail what you've responded to, the revisions that you've done, so that I can compare that to the list, the letter that I sent to you earlier. So there's a lot of granular detail involved. So I think, let's see. We have
Moses,
yes.
Moses. So somebody posted a question in the Q&A that was directed to me that I wanted to just briefly respond to. So it says, perhaps I can elaborate on key questions that are important to African history scholars. So referencing what I said in my first remarks. I mean, you know, I can give you one recent example of something that we rejected because it was not, it really was not engaging African history. This was a submission that was making an argument about a particular, I'm anonymizing as much as I can, but making an argument that a particular famous incident in East African history had played a very important part in kind of destroying race science as a kind of intellectual framework for thinking about Africa. And the way that the scholar chose to make the argument was essentially to write a lot about European race thinkers from the 19th century into the 20th century, expounding on their thinking and the effect that it had on, you know, colonial practice and all of that, right? And then making kind of a very big leap to arguing that that another incident in African history kind of equalized that or neutralized it, I guess is the right word. So, I mean, the key problem here is that we're not going to publish a piece that centers European racist thinkers as the main subject matter of a JAH article. Okay, so when I say we want to publish things that are rooted in sensibilities of African historians of Africa and African historians, that's one example of something that we would not consider to be appropriate. However, one could imagine other scenarios where it would be appropriate to draw on those kinds of primary sources published by racist European thinkers in order to make an argument about, say, the making of apartheid or the making of white settler politics in Kenya, or, you know, you can think of many other kinds of examples, I'm sure. But what we can't do is center imperial thought, colonial thought, global north thought without it contributing to a specific kind of making of African history that centers African peoples. Does that make sense? And editors, please jump in if there are better examples. I'm just using one that was recent that we had discussion about.
Well, that's an excellent example. Another example is, don't send us a piece dealing with a particular Christian missionary. You know, in the Nigerian area, that's quite popular. Reverend Father Townsend. This paper is on some Irish Catholic, some that died white priest that died a long time ago. It's not African. That's not the Journal of African History. It's not about, no, okay. Also, that's another example, because we do get quite a few of those types of submissions. Another example that I would like to add is, don't give us a journal article that deals only with colonial policy on taxation, showing the different versions of the policy, how the policy developed, the correspondence between the white colonial officials. We are not showing the effect of this policy on Africans, on Nigerians. We are not showing how Nigerians resisted. We are not showing the ways in which Nigerians use their agency and use their power maybe to navigate this system. You are only showing the policy, the correspondence, the development. No. We're not interested in that. So that's imperial history. There's a journal for that, the Journal of Imperial and Commonwealth History. Send it to that journal, not to the Journal of African History. So those are two additional examples of the one that Professor Moy gave. All right, I hope that clarifies here. Well, we've come to the end. Thank you very much.
Take part. Yes.